Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar on the impact of illicit trade on the sustainable economy, the Anti-Illicit Trade Declaration, and tech transparency. So as we started 3 months ago, WISEKey and the Oyster Foundation, in cooperation with the Zermatt Summit, is organizing a series of webinars addressed to the issues related to the illicit trade. And now, today, we are very glad to launch the first one with an amazing group of speakers that will cover the different issues related to illicit trade, both into the anti-illicit trade process of protecting consumer and protecting governments. We will talk about technologies that they are available in our days. We will talk about policy, about governments, relations, and how we all together can reinforce an international partnerships to move to concrete actions. So I would like to introduce the panelists. We'll introduce all at once, and after we'll give the floor individually to each of the panelists to cover the subject. The webinar is being recorded and is being transferred live to YouTube. So you can also follow us in YouTube. The webinar includes a Q&A, so you can send us questions. Those questions will be moderated by our team, and those questions will be asked to the panelists, both during their presentations, but also at the end of their presentation. So I will have to, I'd just like to introduce the speaker. I have the honor to have with us today Teresa Moreira, Head of the Competition and Consumer Policy Branch of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. Hello, Teresa. Christopher Wasserman, President, Zermatt Summit Foundation in Switzerland, Zermatt, Switzerland. Bruno Masier, President, World Trade Point Federation, accessing us from Madrid this time. Alvise Giustiniani, Vice President, Illicit Trade Prevention, Philip Morris International from Lausanne. Danil, Kerimi, former Deputy Head of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in China, World Economic Forum, Beijing. Jeffrey Hardy, Director General at Transactional Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, and Johanny Grossman, team leader, Illegal Wildlife Trade, Basel Institute of Governance. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today. And I open the panel. Each panelist will discuss about 5 to 7 minutes. And then we will give some time to the Q&A. We'll give something like 45 minutes on Q&A. So Teresa, thank you for joining us. You're from UNCTAD, the UN specialized agency that is very much focused on working on illicit trade, but also illicit trade prevention from the consumer perspective. But we know that illicit trade threatens the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which it is a top priority for all of us. So how you see that threatening, what is threatening the Sustainable Development Goals, and how can we synchronize efforts to combat it? It is a private-public partnership model on where both private and public sector needs to work together, including governments. So your views on that will be highly appreciated. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity. I would like to start, of course, referring that in 2015, the UN member states representatives agreed on this Agenda 2030 as a framework for inclusive economic growth and sustainable development. And I would highlight 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals that, of course, are being regularly monitored and have a number of indicators and targets that all the UN agencies, but also other international organizations and several private companies across the world and NGOs are committed to, in order to really illustrate how this is a shared effort because of our shared responsibility. So I would highlight what we call, well, the Sustainable Development Goals 8, so on decent work and economic growth, which I believe is relevant when we deal with illicit trade, because of course, licit, legitimate economic activities can only be duly considered, can only be duly recognized, sometimes supported if needed, if, of course, because they are legitimate, which means that it is the only way through decent work and that we can get to economic growth. So I would say that, of course, illicit trade undermines the achievement of this goal. And also SDG goal 12 on responsible production and consumption that appeals both to businesses, manufacturers, distributors, services providers, even, of course, responsibility, but also to consumers. So that is twofold. It aims for supply and for demand. Allow me also to mention SDG 17, so the final SDG, which is about partnership for the goals. Again, underlining that we can only move forward as the world collectively and with joint efforts. So I think it's very interesting that you have a panel representing different views and different stakeholders that are all necessary. Let me add that according to the latest statistics, illicit trade drains 2.2 trillion from global economy every year, nearly 3% of the world's economy, and it is a threat to our health, to our security, to our environment, and to businesses. According to the to statistics, at least 170,000 children may be dying from pneumonia every year because they receive bad drugs to heal them. On the environment front, I think that the estimate annual retail value of illegal logging makes it the world's most profitable natural resources crime, which has everything in what concerns tax revenues, sales and exports, okay, and also of course, unfair competition in a way. And also on the manufacturing side, of course, so OECD reports that there has been an increase of more than 80% in less than 5 years, that is to say from 27 to 2013, which represents 2.5% of world trade. So I think this shows how illicit trade shadows multilateral international trade, and of course UNCTAD, as other international organizations, being so committed to the success of the multilateral trading system. This undermines our efforts, our work, and of course prevents us from fully achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I think I would only say more, Carlos, that there are a number of international organizations that are doing relevant work towards this topic. I would mention the CITES Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, because currently I'm also overseeing the Trade and Environment branch of UNCTAD. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime, of course, tackles with illegal drugs trade. The World Intellectual Property Organization covers obviously copyright and other IP rights infringements. And the World Health Organization, of course, is very concerned with fake drugs. And I think the current pandemic has already shown that in a number of cases, misleading advertising to fake products that could help you prevent getting infected with COVID-19, I think are very, very timely examples. Let me just finish now by saying that UNCTAD has organized since, well, last year, an illicit trade forum. We actually had a very interesting meeting earlier in February this year. And I think that because of our cross-cutting mandates and our natural close interaction with our UN sister organizations, but with any international organization and other partners, we are in a very good place to address these cross-cutting areas and to generate, with, of course, the collaboration of so many others, multi-stakeholder solutions. So I think that for the time being, this is what I would like to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Teresa. Very, very to the point. I would like to move a bit to the, moving from the UN to the private sector, and just ask Alvise to develop a bit with us the, just continuation what Teresa say about the 3% of the world economy. It's now drowned by illicit trade, $2.2 trillion. The World Economic Forum says 8 to 15% of global GDP. goes now to illicit trade. Now, how the private sector, and especially a company like PMI with a product that is highly counterfeited, 38.9 billion in illicit trade cigarettes in 2019. What are you doing to make that fight? And what are the recommendations that you give to other multinationals? Then they are major players in the illicit trade volume. What they need to do in order to combat it in a proactive and efficient way? How is it?
Thank you, Carlos, for the question. I'd like to thank you, Carlo, and YSKI or Eastern in the Zermatt Summit for organizing this webinar, which I find like other ones are quite useful to have a variety of partners from the private and public sector discussing a problem which is extremely complex, as you mentioned, as Teresa mentioned. And the fact that it's so complex, and it's complex because it spans, it is generally transnational. It is based on many different products. Very much the organizations are interlinked. So who smuggles cigarettes is also smuggling alcohol, human beings, and so on and so forth. Across nations, I mentioned, it links together with other crimes like corruptions, like money laundering, like illicit flows of financial illicit flows. So it's extremely complex problem and needs a comprehensive solution. And I think Teresa rightly mentioned it, the SDG 17 goal is public-private partnership. And there are 2 points I would like to make in these opening remarks. One is that public-private partnership, we believe, is extremely important, and then technology. Public-private partnership, so yes, what can Philip Morris do, but we are one of the pawns, one of the elements, but clearly alone we cannot do too much, and we really believe in this public-private partnership to get different actors fighting against illicit trade. So in the public-private partnership, what we did in 2016, we launched a project called PMI Impact, which is a project which is pledging $100 million to finance projects to fight illicit trade. And it's not only illicit trade on cigarettes, but all forms of illicit trades. And the reason being is that, as I mentioned, the illicit trade is interlinked. It's often in the hands of transnational criminal organizations, and they will be smuggling anything that makes money. And therefore, this project is finance projects of all forms of illicit trade. It is on 3 different funding rounds. So we've gone through 2 funding rounds. So far there have been 60 projects financed across, I think, 28 different nations for a total close to $50 million. And I'm happy to see that 2 of the grantees that won these funds are here present in this meeting. And therefore, I really think this is a sign that this PMI Impact project is working in creating a network of private and public partnership in order to fight illicit trade. I think this is extremely important. Once again, we can do something, but the public-private partnership is much more stronger. As somebody said, nobody is perfect, but a team can be. And the second point is on technology. I am a strong believer that technology, while it's also used by organized crime, it does create transparency. That the amount of data available, the fingerprints, the technology that people leave and technology picks up is humongous, and therefore there are so many then fingerprints and that create a perfect situation to find the criminal. So I think technology creating this transparency and all of this data, it is something that in the long run, of course, it's back and forth because it is a bit of a cat and mouse chase. In the long run, I do believe technology is a strong ally to fight illicit trade, to fight money laundering, illicit flow, financial illicit flows, and also corruption. Because I believe in the same token that you can corrupt a person, more difficult to corrupt a machine. So in terms of technology, one of the projects, once also again, is a public-private partnership, is what the EU did in the last years, introducing a track and tracing systems for all packs of cigarettes. in all packs of tobacco, so also loose tobacco. So each pack of cigarettes has a code, a unique code, and then the code is linked to the bundle to the master case, and that is tracked from the producer down to the point of sale. And that's for all tobacco products in Europe as of May 2019 in all member states. And I think that's a great usage of technology, and hopefully then this will be extended to other member states, and then there'll be a network around the world, so all the UN and the member states that have signed international agreements to fight illicit trade will also adopt a track and tracing system, and that will slowly but surely, in my view, help fight illicit trade. I'll stop it here, Carlos, because I know that we have quite a number of panelists, and there's also going to be quite a few questions.
Thank you, Alvise. I will come back to you individually later in the second round. I think yesterday I participated, I don't know if you guys did also, to the Great Reset webinar from the World Economic Forum. And there was a lot of discussions around the need of multi-stakeholders to work together. Basically, we are in a situation that a major reset, the Great Reset, needs to happen, and that requires every single institution to reconsider the way they work and convert that into a more effective way. And obviously, using the fourth industrial revolution technologies and the digital transformation requirement that this implies is a way to go. So I fully agree that the combination of technologies, knowledge, and experience will be required. So maybe, Jeffrey, I mean, you run one of the most effective organizations in the world combating illicit trade in a very proactive and factual way. Maybe give us your insight. Where are we now in this problem? And also, I have some specific question on the current COVID-19 pandemic. Is this profiting the bad guys, or are they losing customers because everybody's locked at home and it cannot travel? What is the situation? What is the status of the situation as we speak now?
Well, thanks, Carlos. So far it's been interesting panel discussion so far. I mean, you know, I think the number one situation is raising awareness, because, you know, we've been doing this for several years now, and a lot needs to change. It's not just about the pandemic or the virus or the impacts on legal trade or illicit trade, but we've got an uphill battle in terms of helping governments understand the interconnected nature of the problem and how that the effects ripple through the economy, like Teresa was talking about earlier. I mean, the effects of illicit trade are on public health, on environmental sustainability, on economics, on security, on prosperity. So we have a lot of work to do. And in a way, we've been sidetracked in that work by the lockdown and the global fears that are spreading because of the virus. But I think there's also some important lessons that we're learning during this time, including how illegal operators will seize any opportunity. Really, you know, the world, our neighbors, and our neighboring countries are facing perhaps, you know, the greatest, you know, health challenge that this generation certainly has seen ever. And meanwhile, you know, illicit traders are aiming to profit from these fears. So, I mean, what we've observed is not all forms of illicit trade really are being impacted, but there's certainly some areas where the situation has been very acute. And I think a lot of that comes from some of the things that we've observed that are happening here is because of the virus, there's limited supply. So that's limited supply of legal products. And whenever there's a limited supply of a legal product, it turns, you know, people to look for alternatives. I think that we've also seen reports from various governments that, you know, law enforcement or customs agents are distracted, or they're confined and not able to effectively do their job, which opens the door for illicit trade, more illicit trade. I think we're seeing the same thing with some of the corporations. Many companies, spend a lot of money and effort on brand protection and, raiding, factories. And that has been reduced or confined because of the lockdown. So you're seeing a little bit of the criminals having a holiday in a way, because the people who are normally trying to stop their activities have been distracted or confined. Speaking of holiday, something else that we're observing here is a little bit of a holiday effect. And we've documented this in the area of counterfeiting, for example, where someone's on holidays and they might be more inclined to buy a pair of counterfeit sunglasses, but they wouldn't do that at home or in their home markets. But I think everyone's confined to home, everyone's shopping online, everyone's sort of feeling like somehow this isn't real and this situation isn't real. And I think that creates a situation where people are more inclined to purchase a counterfeit or a substitute. There's also less disposable income, which drives people toward illicit markets. And then, like I mentioned, there's more shopping online. I think we really need to look at that situation intently because there's already a major problem online shopping of fraud, and we're seeing that in multiple product sectors. So those are some of the observations that we have that we've made so far. I mean, I can talk about some of the sectors: pharmaceuticals, personal protection equipment, and alcohol in particular. But why don't I pause for a second as moderator and see whether you want me to go on there or move on to another speaker.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I'll get back to you later on the health sector, because I think this is an important one, especially in the current situation. Maybe just so we cover as much as we can in this first round. Juhani, the Basel Institute on Governance, I mean, two major issues happening, which I think you must cover. One is the wildlife origin of the illicit trade. I mean, the interconnectivity between wildlife and the epidemic. I don't know if this has been already established, but obviously that practice is of concern, because that could not only continue happening as many countries are. This is a very big market volume, but also is very difficult to regulate as the wildlife consumption in some countries is legal and part of their customs. And another part is that in some countries we have observed that mafias actually are taking the role of governments in helping poor people. We see what is happening in the Brazilian favelas and many other places. And sometimes people are actually trusting more the capability of this underworld to solve their problem than their own government. So this trust deficit that we are facing now in government, is that something that it is a concern from your observation? And how can we bring back the trust to where it really belongs? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, and the other panelists. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, these are fascinating issues to discuss, and I really appreciate the insights of the other panelists, because we're coming at the same issue from very different perspectives, which is, I suppose, the purpose of this event. We're an anti-corruption group, so we're an NGO based in Switzerland that focuses on all aspects of fighting corruption, including the enforcement and the prevention side, as well as the collective action and public-private partnerships. And we are applying these anti-corruption tools to environmental crime in general, and in particular the illicit wildlife trade. Because, well, for several reasons. This is kind of an unusual combination, right? But we do so for several reasons. One is that the scale of the illicit wildlife trade is gigantic, actually. The UN estimates put it at between 7 and 23 billion dollars a year. We see global supply chains. We see a wide array of very complex species. And we see a situation where the differentiation between legal and illegal trade is quite difficult at times. And of course, Carlos, as you mentioned, most lately, the security risk, the health risk that came along with the illegal wildlife trade is on everybody's mind, right? I did I did a check the other day about how frequently people are searching on Google for wildlife trade or wildlife markets, and that has increased drastically over the last few months. The searches for pangolin have increased 10 times in the last 3 months. Who knew what a pangolin was in 2019? So yeah, the issue is really at the forefront of everybody's mind. But what we see, like other illicit trade, the illicit wildlife trade is really empowered by corruption. And this is, of course, where our expertise comes in. We see that poachers bribe rangers to get access to parks. We see that law enforcement officers get bribed if the poachers are caught. We see, of course, the bribing of customs officers and port officials so that traffickers can move their goods. And we see that, and this is crucial to this particular health crisis that we're facing, we see that in destination countries, health inspectors are being bribed to enable sellers to continue flogging their dangerous goods. And so cumulatively, we think that corruption has basically enabled what was a low-level poaching, sometimes subsistence poaching, has allowed that to mutate into an international criminal enterprise. And that's, of course, again, very similar to some of the other types of illicit crime, illicit trade that we see here, that we're discussing today. And the recognition that these two things are inherently linked was made just today, in fact, by the Financial Action Task Force, which issued a long report on the connection between the illegal wildlife trade and corruption and money laundering. As well as the OECD, which issued a statement recently, the G20, which issued a statement as early as 2017. So this is an established connection. And so what we try to do is we try to follow the money. We try to go beyond the initial poaching that takes place and try to roll up the criminal networks that stand behind that. We do that by embedding experts in wildlife law enforcement agencies. We really appreciate the support. We're one of the 2 grantees on this panel from PMI Impact, and we really appreciate that support because it's been crucial in establishing that connection solidly. Carlos, you asked about this PPPs and the importance about the relationship between the private and the public sector. This has been actually, I would argue, a success story where the private sector has become very engaged, in particular the financial and the transport companies, which are crucial to enable the illicit wildlife trade. Without the financial sector, they can't move their money, they can't pay for wares, they can't receive payment, they can't launder their proceeds, they can't safeguard their assets. And without the transport sector, of course, they can't move any of their goods, as we see right now, where passenger air traffic, which is a major contributor towards moving illicit wildlife, has basically been cut off. And so what we've observed recently is that while the movement of goods has been made more difficult because of a lack of transport connections, we also see an increase in poaching because of the economic environment in many source countries having gotten even more difficult than it was before. And so what we expect is that we would see stockpiling and then as soon as the market opens again, probably a flooding of the markets. So I'll stop there for a minute, except maybe I'll just talk about trust for a second, because of course we have big trust issues here in government where basically governments are not taking the illicit wildlife trade serious enough. And many scientists, I'm not a scientist, but many scientists argue that this has been the cause of COVID-19 and all the economic hardship that came along with it. But also, of course, we see tremendous corruption problems in the response to COVID-19, both in the economic response, in the health response, in the investments that governments make, which are not always safeguarded from corruption and have the potential to even further erode trust in government. So that's something to watch very carefully.
Thank you, Giovanni. I'll come back later to you on that as well. So I would like to give now the floor to Danil Kerimi. So Danil, we know each other for many years on our work in the World Economic Forum, and I have been following your trajectory and the amazing input that you had in creating these 4th Industrial Revolution centers, in particular in China, and also in San Francisco. And you have been in the forefront of the technology by basically dealing with top CEOs from all the major technology companies in the world, both in Europe, United States, and China. Where do you see the use of technology to solve this problem? I mean, we are a technology company, so we obviously use the technology for the good purposes, but we are aware that other people are using technology to further create a major problem in this illicit trade ecosystem. So what is your advice on that, and who's doing right and who's doing wrong? And what is the technology that you think is disruptive enough to put a stop on all this?
Thank you very much, Carlos, and it's a great pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panelist. I mean, I'm taking notes, and I don't know whether I'm excited about the possibility of technology or terrified by the numbers that Teresa cited, and Alvise and Jeff, and certainly Juhani. But before I proceed to answer your directly question, I think it would be helpful perhaps for us to give a little bit a mental framework, how we can think about the intersection between technology and illicit trade. And I would say that, I'm a big fan of Kratzberg laws of technology, and his first law states that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It always comes with the decisions, and decisions it's thus that humans are making, making cautious choices about what technology we're deploying in which situations. Now, when we talk about tech, a few speakers have already touched upon the different aspects. Jeff mentioned, e-commerce platforms. Juhani and others talked about how the criminals are adapting. So if you think about tech, you have to understand that there are three dimensions. Tech as a catalyst of illicit trade, and there it could be anything from utilization of the latest technology to sell counterfeit goods, to smuggle it. There were reports about, as the lockdown intensified around the world, drug smugglers, narcos were trying to use drones to deliver their products and so on and so forth. So there's a great quote unquote innovation that is happening about utilization technology as a catalyst of illicit trade. But then there is, of course, technology as an inhibitor of illicit trade. And there where I'm the most excited about, from again, the same technology that can be used to drop a drugs package at your doorstep, you can actually use drones to monitor. You could utilize blockchain for trade finance. I'm particularly excited about 2 or 3 areas, broad areas, where I see a great promise that technology brings in countering the illicit trade. And one of them is, of course, digital signatures, IoT-enabled devices. As you deploy all those sensors, all those devices, it just brings the transaction costs of all the criminals so much higher. It's not that it's impossible, but it's now so much higher. It's so much harder to actually achieve their goal. So I'm particularly excited about technology solutions that your company is offering, Carlos, but many, many others as well. And then one area where I think a lot of, as I was listening to previous speakers, that holds a lot of promise is the whole area of volatile organic compounds. That has a lot of every organism, every object in the world has a VOC signature, be it organic life, certainly for sure, but even non-organic areas where you use DNA. You can use DNA tracing and barcoding to trace animals and so on, but you cannot really do that with alcohol or cigarettes. But you certainly can do that with the chemical signatures that every object has. And I'm very excited about recent breakthroughs in terms of democratization of this technology, in terms of minimization, miniaturization of this tech, that we'll see the tidal wave really shifting very, very soon. And then the third dimension, finally, I wanted to mention, because otherwise our picture about intersection of technology and illicit trade would not be complete, is of course technology as an object of illicit trade. This became very much in headlines everywhere, but from anything from smuggling nuclear materials or know-how to dual-use tech, we cannot forget that illicit trade also expands in trading the technology itself. And as every speaker in this panel will probably agree, there is no other way but to design very agile, very responsive, very solid public-private partnerships that bring stakeholders around the world. And the stakeholders have to be, of course, governments, not only national, also the city-level governments, regional-level governments, urban, municipal, provincial, and so on. But also the big companies that already have a very huge client base, brands to protect, very innovative startups, scale-ups. We have to commercialize technology that is still sitting in the labs across the world, in different universities that are really need to see the light of the day. And we obviously absolutely mission critical the input from the civil society around the world and international organizations that can really help us scale it up and keep us honest as we are rolling out those deployments. Perhaps I'll pause here right for now, Carlos. But just before I do that, actually, one other thing I want to urge every speaker to think through. We all know that there are cataclysmic events that always really push the boundaries of what's possible and what's feasible and the way we think about it. And the deployment of both illicit trade tactics and opportunities that we saw shifting from those big events, also to deployment of technology and how to counter it, is actually quite tremendous. You know, big data analytics, AI, machine learning became huge in monitoring financial transactions after 9/11. The whole global trade and global security of trade routes has been completely reimagined post 9/11 as well. And I do trust that this current pandemic will force exactly that type of fundamental shift in the mindset of both criminals that will try to utilize it, but also of law enforcement officials and us, clients, citizens, consumers, that need to think hard and fast about what will come once things will quote unquote normalize. So perhaps here I will pause and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Danil. Thank you. So, as we, in my introduction, I mentioned the Zermatt Summit has been instrumental in addressing this issue. It was actually Christopher in 2018 and then gave us the opportunity to organize a high-level panel. At that time, it was a physical panel in Zermatt, where we basically drafted the Anti-Illicit Trade Declaration. And the spirit of that was to set some kind of principles, which are generic and universal principles, just to guide corporations, governments, and NGOs and private citizens to establish some precautions when they are entering into illicit trade transactions. But one other thing I got very much attracted by the spirit of the Zermatt Summit is this concept of Christopher, of servant leadership. I believe that one drastic way to reduce illicit trade is by educating the consumers. One is key. When we started to secure watches in Switzerland, very luxury watches in Switzerland, and we have now millions of watches in Switzerland now protected by our technology, we run that in parallel to explain teenagers and millennials, you know, why you should not buy a fake watch. I mean, although it looks great, maybe you, because the quality is so high, where that money is going, how you are contributing to aggravate the problem. I mean, basically you are feeding the bank account of the bad guys by doing that. So I think this servant leadership concept is critical for the common good. And maybe Christopher, what was the vision you had when you created the Zermatt Summit, and how you have been, I know you have applied that to many sectors, not only illicit trade, environmental and other, but I think this is a preemptive process that we all need to have.
Thank you, Carlos, for inviting me. And I'm not an expert on illicit trade, but more on the legitimate, or let's say the licit economy. And I believe, being a little bit provocative, if the illicit, or let's say the official economy worked better, we would have less illicit trade. What we, behind the Zermatt Summit is a foundation, so there's no big company. I'm an entrepreneur coming from the biotech field. And in 2009, after the financial crisis, we thought we should organize a meeting, and the WEF is saying the same now, where all stakeholders work together in developing new economic models. And the red thread of these new economic models is that the human being has to be at the center. I think Danil said this very rightly. I mean, technology is important, but It has to serve a purpose, right? So the idea behind the Zermatt Summit was to bring together people from the private sector, but also and show that the private sector, in collaboration with the public sector, with civil society, with scientists, with other stakeholders, can come up with new models and new ideas. That's innovative new ideas for the economy. What we try to say is that finance should serve the economy should serve the common good, and the common good should serve the human being. The concept of servant leadership actually came about the fact that if a leader in a company has a possibility to show, to make sure that in his company he is actually has the concept of sustainability, he's going to serve his company or his organization rather than serving himself. So actually the notion of responsibility comes up. We don't believe in our team that we can regulate everything by law, even though you need law, you need rule of law, but you need also people to behave in the right way. And obviously this is not an easy thing to do, because you need to work with. So we've actually attracted more than 1,000 leaders over the last 10 years. We have managed to integrate these values, a purpose in their companies, and who are successful economically, financially, but also have been able to show that by being a servant leader, you can actually achieve these goals. The concept of the common good is not the same as the public interest. It's actually taking care of all individual needs, but also the needs of a group. We feel that business or the private sector, in collaboration with other stakeholders, can be a force for good, can actually work for society by solving, you heard about social entrepreneurs, by solving social, societal, environmental problems in an efficient way. Not to be too long, just to go back to what Maria Teresa Moreira said, I'm also part of the B Lab certification organization, which is a US initiative, which is working with the UN Global Compact on a program to establish a roadmap for companies who want to get involved with the SDG goals. It's called Sdg Action Manager. It's very interesting. You can see this on the web, on the bcorp.net. And there's thousands of companies now who are actually using this tool because the SDG are macroeconomic goals, and here you want to try to do this on a company level and establish a roadmap, not only a financial, economical roadmap, which we obviously need, but also a roadmap for social, societal, environmental goals. And so it's quite concrete, and I think this shows also that some companies have realized that the goal of a company is obviously making money, but it's not only that; it has a much wider scope. And those companies who have this long-term vision, I believe, can create jobs, can be innovative, and can indirectly, in all countries, reduce the impact of illicit trade.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Thank you very much. And we should be, as soon as we can meet physically, continue our work in Zermatt. And it's a great place to, by the way, organize a summit, as the city is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. So we look forward to continue working with you. So I would like to deep dive a bit now on the private sector. At the end of the day, we need full participation of the private sector in order to have allies at national level, I would say even at city level, that can help into the inspection, verification, and certification of products, companies, and people. I mean, you need the last mile. And we have here one expert that has been working over 20 years in this, first with the UN, as this project emerged as an UNCTAD project originally. and then was a spin-off in a federation, non-for-profit federation, which is basically to create electronic commerce centers all over the world, the trade points, the famous trade point. And Bruno has been the champion of this initiative in so many countries. And you have seen so many things in the last 20 years because you are in the front end on international trade. So Bruno, what are the good practices where we are doing this right? And what is your recommendation for private sector to join your network and further contribute to this, what I call essential last mile, because without that last mile, we will keep on the theoretical talk to act locally. So floor is yours, Bruno.
Good afternoon to all audience, and thank you, Carlos, for your kind introduction and your question. But let me bring some context into my answer. First of all, the words going shopping no longer means a trip to a local mall, but browsing a world of online goods and sellers from smartphone, tablets, and other devices. And second, while counterfeit and pirated goods have been sold for years on street corners, fly markets, now these illicit goods are now marketed to consumers into their homes through increasingly mainstream e-commerce platforms. It is clear that selling counterfeit and pirated goods through e-commerce is a highly profitable activity. Why? Production costs are low, millions of potential consumers are available online, transactions are convenient, and also listing in a well-branded e-commerce platform provides also an air of legitimacy. This is why trade in counterfeit now stands, as all speakers mentioned, at 3.3% of our global trade. And the situation is that beyond all effort that the governments are making or the actions that the big players like Alibaba or Amazon are taking, this situation is not improving. The evidence indicates that while the expansion of e-commerce had led to a greater trade facilitation, its overall growth, especially the growth of certain related business model, has facilitated online trafficking in counterfeit and pirated goods. And it's easy also to understand. Global scale, transactions just in one click, almost everyone can create a website, lack of global rules and legislation, and custom lakes of resources to perform their work. This is why it is imperative to move forward so that e-commerce models can be transformed into a reliable ecosystems. Trust is the key word, but based on concrete tools that can guarantee it. In my opinion, the first step that can transform everything in e-commerce models is to work to reduce anonymity and false identities. You know, the ability to demonstrate that you are who you said that you are is fundamental part of the economic and social development, because it allows us to access to basic public and private services such health, education, and financial services. Now it's time to add the e-commerce also to that list. In concrete, our digital identity is a set of attributes which in the online environment can be disaggregated and combined in different contexts, and with different levels also of relativity. So the use of the identity validated by the government allowed us to carry out transactions more secure than other allowed by Facebook identity, which we can use to interact with our friends, or LinkedIn to connect with our colleagues. But all these frameworks validate users in their own way to operate in their closed system. And this is the same things that happen in different e-shops or e-marketplaces. This leads us to a panorama in which digital identity management is fragmented, and the need for interoperable e-trade ID system is urgently needed, allowing the identities generated by different validating agencies, but interconnected, to be recognized and accepted by different e-marketplaces. Trust is a key concept in validation process again, but government action alone is not enough. All relevant private sector stakeholders have critical role to play and must adopt the best practice identified to collect and validate information on sellers and products, and to be incorporated into e-trade ID profiles. For this reason, validated centers integrated by government, business institutions, and trade facilitation companies, including IT services, have a key role, and especially if they are established in physically proximity to the companies they will certify. You know, the famous last and critical mile that needs to be traveled effectively to guarantee the success in the application of any policy. This is my point of view of this first stage of the situation and its solution suggested. Of course, as a logical consequence, other challenges will appear, such as data protection and cybersecurity, and so on. But it is life, one challenge behind the other. You know, solution anyway will eventually come as companies, governments, and regulators are seeking globally solutions with which users can identify themselves reliably, safely, while offering us attractive products and service for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Absolutely. I think the work of the Trade Point Federation is essential, as together with the chambers of commerce or post offices, they are localized in critical areas where people can go and register themselves and have a human interaction. I mean, combining the virtual with the physical is always the best way to bring efficiency. So I think we have covered pretty well the problems and the respective views of those problems. Maybe I would like to deep dive a bit more, because I think it's an important issue, especially now, is on the consumer side, the consumer protection side. As from our experience, some brands have problems of adding costs to their product, and we know that because we are on the now. After the UN, I am now in the private sector, so I am feeling the pain of convincing companies to put money in protecting their products, because their products, if they're not protected, they are easy to counterfeit. The problem is some of them, they see that as a cost issue, and they say, why I should add few cents more to my product, I will make my product less competitive. The moment you explain to them that the consumer benefits from that, because the consumer engagement with an authenticated object, let's say a camera or a drone or a router, whatever that object is, if you peer with your mobile phone with that object, the consumer gets the authentication that the object is authentic. So there's no issue there, and they can validate that with the brand. But the brand also gets information from the consumer, and it's a consumer engagement technology. I remember when I was doing a project with a leading watch manufacturer in Switzerland, his concern was, I have 16 million consumers that buy my perfumes in duty-free, and I don't know them. I would like to sell them watches and jewelry and everything else I do, but the entry point will be, how can I capture that relation when they buy a bottle of perfume and they pay with a credit card? Therefore, the relation is with the credit card and not with the brand. So consumer protection is also at the same time a consumer engagement opportunity. And I think there's where the money is going to come, to convince brands to put security in their objects as a way to reduce illicit trade. But anyway, I think we have a great expert here with us, Teresa, on the consumer protection and the UNCTAD mandate. You have a few slides as well to share with us on that. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And could I now ask the other Carlos to show my slide? Thank you very much. No, just to say that, well, among other things, UNCTAD is the focal point for consumer protection within the UN system. And you may not know, because this is unfortunately not very well known, but in 1985, the UN General Assembly approved the UN guidelines for consumer protection that were so far revised twice. Once to add in 99 sustainable consumption, which I believe it's also relevant to this discussion. And let's say the largest revision took place in 2015, so it's rather recent, and it really modernized the scope of the guidelines, broadened it, and highlighted a number of aspects that I listed because I believe they're extremely relevant to what we're discussing. So first of all, we are all consumers, obviously, and we are all consumers also according to the guidelines when we buy goods and services for our personal consumption or for the consumption of our household. Meaning that this is a capacity, this is in a way a condition that we should also cherish. And even though across the world, a number of jurisdictions have enacted consumer protection legislations. So, of course, and governments are entrusted with the mandate to enforce consumer rights. For 25 years at least, there has been this increasingly, let's say, trend towards consumer empowerment, meaning that consumers have rights that should be protected by public authorities, that should be respected by businesses, by goods manufacturers, by services providers. But we as consumers also have a little bit the obligation of get information and of make use of the education, between brackets, of information campaigns, of all possible means to make informed choices and to act in a responsible and sustainable way. And I think this is very interesting because, of course, one of the key consumer rights across the world is the consumer right to products that are healthy and safe, so to speak. And UNCTAD has actually started working on a consumer product safety because it's a very cross-cutting issue. Of course, it covers food and non-food products, but in a way, there are a lot of illicit products that are a danger, that are a hazard for consumers' health. And it is very important that consumers, but also authorities, of course, are aware of this. I also mentioned consumer information and education. I'm sure like several of us, and it was very interesting to hear that there were so many common points between all interventions. I do believe that awareness raising, information, and even education, not only of consumers, I tell you, also of businesses, of entrepreneurs, of MSMEs, of startups, I think that is vital. I think consumers are increasingly sophisticated all over the world because they have access to technology, as it has been very well pointed out. So this means that, of course, we can, with an electronic device, your cell phone, have access to information from all over the world, of course. Then we say, there's so much information available, how can I pick the information that is relevant for me? So this means to say that there is still, and there's always work to do in that front, but through consumer awareness raising, through consumer information and education, it is definitely possible at least to make consumers aware of the risks, of the negative consequences that come from buying illicit goods. And I think that has a huge potential because, of course, usually one tends to look more on the supply side, and that's also why governments and international organizations and even private companies, of course, get together in putting in place a number of mechanisms to be able to, as we heard, to trace illegal products, to validate, to authentify, to track this kind of trade. And of course, and it is for authorities to enforce the law. But there is a lot of work to do from my point of view on the consumer side, even though I do believe that consumers are increasingly receptive to sustainability concerns. So definitely also to legality concerns, as long as that is fully explained, as long as they really understand the consequences. And of course, this needs to be combined, from my point of view, with stronger enforcement. And this, of course, associates all governments, all agencies, and obviously other stakeholders. I also wanted to mention that the revised guidelines for consumer protection actually added an interesting new chapter on good business practices. So for the first time, the guidelines that are mostly aiming to member states' governments, but also to some NGOs like consumer groups. For the first time, they target good business practices, appealing for a more responsible, and I would say maybe a more ethical behavior. And so it was also very interesting to learn about the Zermatt summit and the number of initiatives that are taking place, well, all over the world, and especially here in Switzerland, because also here, I do believe there is a huge potential. In my previous professional experiences in consumer protection at national level, I always thought that we cannot have effective consumer protection without business engagement. So it is true that well, law infringements need to be tackled by authorities, and so the law needs to be enforced, but this should never prevent consumer protection authorities and other public authorities to have a dialogue and to reach out to businesses and to businesses representatives in order to together find solutions that can provide a safer environment for businesses to do business and for consumers to buy. A final word, just to say, of course, that the guidelines talk a lot about collaboration of, well, very much along the lines of the private-public partnerships that we heard about. Also working with other international organizations. And to finalize, I would like to just finish on technology. Of course, technology is a key instrument for increased consumer empowerment. Of course, through digital tools, there are a number of very interesting experiences in developing countries to, let's say, bring consumers together with authorities to raise their awareness. So there are a number, for instance, in Latin American countries, such as Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, that are facilitating a little bit consumers to grasp the necessary information to make those informed, responsible, and sustainable choices. So I definitely think that technology is a key instrument. And of course, during the COVID-19 crisis, the fact that shopping online became, let's say, almost our own connection with the outside world that was in lockdown, I do believe that appealing for a responsible conduct also by digital platforms is a key goal to proceed. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Maybe just to share back. So I think what you say is very important, and everybody's a consumer. And if we can extrapolate that notion, everybody then has an identity, has a consumer identity. And as you know, there is one of the SDGs is to provide a legal identity to everybody in the world by the year 2030. So this is a major endeavor, because from my experience, I have been working in identity 40 years, is that there's clusters of identities, you know, so you have private sector identities, government's identities, you have so many identities, but they are not compatible, they are not interoperable, and it's impossible to create an ecosystem which is large enough to basically have critical mass. And that's why Facebook and Google and all these companies, they realized that deficiency, and they were very smart in creating a de facto digital identity consumer, profile, which is basically the one we use on the internet. But obviously this is not being distributed equally. This is only making these companies very powerful, very rich, and in violation on privacy and many rights that normally should be consumer right, including the consent right, which is a major consumer right. So maybe before I move to also Bruno on that, what is the possibility of using this SDG 16.9, which is the digital identity for 1.6 billion, that includes refugee, that includes kids, that includes women, that currently they don't even exist. I mean, the fact they don't have a legal identity, they cannot even receive money, they cannot receive help, they cannot receive health services because they are not registered anywhere. So where is the driver from somebody like UNCTAD in pushing this consumer identity, but at the same time, deploy this legal identity that is part of the priorities of the UN Secretary General?
I think the most important thing is to combine, all the possibilities that you have to go one thing up to the other to make sure that the certification of the people are the correct. Because many times we are trying to certify by online ways or other things, but if you don't have the physical presence to certify the data that you are including in the system, is completely a fake process. We already passed for a lot of time hearing about all the possibilities that blockchain will bring to us to secure the information. But it's not sense to secure information if you are including wrong information in the system. So the key factors still, again, in the physical presence and the human interaction. For that reason, if we want to link with all the development points, the most important is to have, from global policy perspective, a close linkages with the government and other institutions who could bring your policy to the last person that needed. It's always the same that we speak about the last mile. If you cannot control the linkages between policies and the people that the policies will affect it, is missing action. And for that, many policies created at global level are never taking the final objective for which they will create it.
Bruno, I agree, but this digital identity, this SDG 16.9 is actually ratified by all the UN members. So we are as near as we can be of an international standard or coalition that by the year 2030, which is in 10 years time, every single human should have a legal identity. Is not a digital identity. It's one step before, right? It's been legalized. But obviously, in an internet economy, a legal identity is being issued digitally. So it will be a shortcut to create also a consumer identity. So Teresa, what is your views as a UN official on that?
Thank you. Well, that's a very difficult question. Of course, I'm familiar with the target and with the indicator. Let me say that what I think is that when you talk about a legal identity, of course, you are talking about, I would say, human rights, which go beyond then consumer protection, because, well, our rights when we buy goods and services still relate to our role in the market. So we are still focusing on economic transactions. Of course, in some countries, consumer rights are very close to citizenship and so to social, political rights. But I do believe that when we talk about the identity, that is something that, well, comes first. I think the problem is that, well, it's in any case, I think it is a very interesting and important goal, not easy to be achieved, of course, especially with the migrants movements that we have been witnessing all over the world, with the well, let's say even with statistics and let's say census of population in a number of developing countries. I do think that the use of digital means, so I do absolutely agree that technology is essential, but I do believe, unfortunately, that this has, how can I put it, bigger political implications that unfortunately I'm not really qualified to talk about right now. Thank you.
Fair enough, fair enough. I really believe that in few years' time, in any case, by sure before the year 2030, a consumer protection will not be possible without a consumer identity, because how are you going to protect in a digital world? You need an anchor, you need a digital anchor into the platform in order to be protected. But maybe we can discuss a bit more. And I think, you know, during my UN times, as Teresa did, we visit many countries around the world, and we are very close to the problem. And I'm sure Jeffrey and Alvise and you guys have done the same. In some countries, the only way to make money is selling illicit product for poor people. So how you solve that problem? How do you diversify the person that is planting, you know, something in order to, how you convince somebody to stop doing something to put their effort in something else if there's not a business model for that else? I mean, poverty, it's one of the first activators of illicit trade and counterfeiting. And in many countries you go and they treat illicit trade and counterfeiting as a social, cultural thing, which is less dramatic than how we perceive that in OECD economy. So some views from that, Jeff or Alvise?
Well, I think you're raising an extremely, extremely good point, Carlos, because consumers sometimes are also the victims. And where we have what's called the conflict economies, where there's lack of rule of law, war areas, as you mentioned, Carlos, people survive since many decades, in a century, in trading. I wouldn't say illegal trading, but for them it's trading products from one part of the border, from one side to the other side. And I think also Ioanni mentioned today that in Africa, due to the crisis, people resort to poaching because it's the only way they can survive. So this puts an extra, another dimension, another element to the equation. And I don't have a quick and easy solution. There's no silver bullet, but for sure, the solutions need to be localized to take in consideration the situation in the specific area where you want to do this, try to tackle this issue. And it has to be a solution that takes in consideration all the elements and also what is possible for these people to survive. I mean, you cannot take away the illicit if they're going to be starving. And therefore, it has to be a solution with developing some kind of other legal economies or legal activities that people can survive. But it's not easy, but I'm glad you mentioned this point, Carlos, because often consumers are victims as well. And there is no global solution, but they have to be localized to take in consideration the specificities of this situation.
But obviously, I remember in our discussions we had in other events that your example about how to incentivize farmers of not selling the tobacco crops to mafias, but rather to go through the official distribution. You know, so how you incentivize farmers to do that? How do you go and explain a farmer that working with PMI it's better than working with mafias and injecting tobacco into illegal tobacco trade?
Oh, this is one example, one specific example. You have to come with programs, and that's what we do, which are long-term programs where you help them in their business, and that means that you help them at getting the right seeds, the right fertilizer, the right methodology to get more product out of their grounds, out of their small piece of land. You finance them because often they are basically stuck, that they don't have the funds to buy the seeds, the fertilizer to start producing, and they get then in the hands of people that are less scrupulous, and they will lend them the money, but at least then they have a tremendous interest to pay and so on. So they get stuck in that loop. So what we do is we help them do their job better. That also includes sometimes better places to live and schooling for the kids. But it is, but you have to work with the local network and the local social tissue that you have in the country to adapt this solution to the local needs. I think for me, there's no global solution you can implement. It has to be really local.
Thank you very much. Maybe Giovanni, you on wildlife? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add actually. I think it's correct, of course, that the lack of access to illicit trade that those people don't have. So because they can't access it, they engage in illicit trade, right? So sometimes we think of it as a pure sort of cost calculation, but it is actually much more complex than that. We conducted a study on the drivers, the social and societal drivers of why people engage in wildlife trafficking, and it's much more complex than a cost calculation, right? It engages the fact, for example, that people who engage in it do not understand that they are in fact victims of this crime. You know, animals are there to be used by humans. What's the big deal? So, and I would imagine that probably other illicit trade suffers from the same lack of understanding of that they are in fact significant victims. In some cases, it's even a moral right that people perceive. I live next to the wildlife. I should be able to use it. In fact, the wildlife encroaches on my crops or my agricultural business. So it's only fair. So I think what Alvise is saying about the importance to a local-based approach, where we find ways to allow communities to engage in benefiting, and I dare use the word profiting, from the resources that are around them, is really crucial, as well as, of course, education and explaining the long-term consequences. And wildlife is a perfect example, right? If all the wildlife is poached, then there's no more wildlife to poach, never mind benefiting from tourists that will come visit it. So this is the very definition of an unsustainable business.
Absolutely. Jeff, any views on that as well? Maybe Christopher later?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the original nature of your question was, where governments are allowing workers to, make an income through an informal market. And, I think that, the challenge of transitioning from informal markets to formal markets is a gigantic question. And it's bigger than illicit trade. But I do think that, in those cases where this is where governments accept this informality or this able to, make income from illicit trade is, it's a minority, it's a small number of cases. And I think that those governments look at it as an easy way out, as opposed to actually formalizing their economy and putting the right economic measures in place. And I also think that in those places where that exists, or where the government accepts that as a mode of economic activity, is also connected to corruption, where those particular governments, they don't really have this incentive to formalize the economy because they're benefiting. And I think there are many, many examples of that. So that's why, going back to this question of the SDGs, that's why we're so passionate about connecting illicit trade to the global nature of the SDGs. And I think, if we thought that would be perhaps finally a compelling way to demonstrate to governments that there are dividends that can be paid, that they can benefit from by fighting illicit trade, because of all the things that we've been talking about. All this illegal activity is interconnected, from corruption to money laundering, right, to forced labor. So, and then to economic growth and security and organized crime. I mean, the list goes on. So I think I really think that fighting illicit trade can, bring major benefits to governments, and it's up to us to show how that happens, how that they can benefit from that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I agree. Christopher, you want to say something?
Very shortly, I think this COVID crisis has shown us that we need to have short supply circuits. You know, industries like automotive and global industries have suffered terribly because of lack of spare parts, because parts were manufactured in 20 different countries. The lockdown just completely prevented parts to go to the assembly lines. We had also the situation with sanitary masks. You know, they're all produced in China or in Asia, and we didn't have masks in our countries. So I think there's going to be a shift to local produced strategic products. But what I can give another example, which is interesting, and this is only in Switzerland, but you know, I did not go to department stores to buy vegetables. I went directly to farmers. Farmers were selling actually their vegetables, biomarkets, all that stuff. So I think we as a consumers obviously have a choice, but if we can give opportunities to a local, and at the Zermatt summit, we speak about all sorts of examples inspired by nature of opportunities to actually create jobs for people in developing countries, in developed countries. But this requires a rather big change in the way we educate some of these people as entrepreneurs and to exploit these opportunities. So there's not one answer, but obviously there are some examples where there are some opportunities to do things differently and create jobs and then prevent illicit trade, obviously.
Thank you, Christopher. I think the interconnectiveness of all this and in cooperation with the different stakeholders is critical. We just got some questions, and one of them is from David Luna, as he's sitting with you, Alvise, on the business at the OECD Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group, and he's asking the potential cooperation in expanding the work to the people and the networks represented on this panel. So this is exactly what we are trying to achieve with these events. There's a technology question which I could answer, but I will give the Danil the priority to do it. It's related to what are the chances that the consumer will actually scan a QR code or authentication. Especially the most solution company will require the consumer to download a specific application to scan it. I believe relying on a solution that requires the consumer to take the action isn't very effective. So bottom line, is any universal technology that allows the detection of whether the product is fake or not? I have ideas like NFC and the new standards, and they are facilitating this, as you don't need to develop an app or download an app anymore. But anyway, Danil, some views on that, on traceability, on technology, on products. This is from Hazem Ibrahim.
Right. So no, again, technology has a great potential. It can be part of a problem, it can be part of a solution, it can be itself a product and an object of trade itself. So I would like to pick up actually on a couple of threads before I answer this question. And indeed, as Christopher was saying, there will be great redesign of supply chains moving forward. They will become shorter, they will become more automated, they will become more resilient. Now, as that process is happening today, it's critical that we keep the illicit trade on the back of our mind as we design the new systems, not just repeating the same mistakes later on or trying to fix the bugs, but actually making those decisions as part of the design architecture. Another thing is that I wanted to say is that it requires the whole society effort, right? There are different, there will be 2 or 3 really big kind of change management opportunities that any transformation will require. And that will be, government procurement, insurance, consumer education. So all of that will play a role. Now, in terms of tech, I absolutely believe that there is an opportunity. Yes, Ibrahim, to answer your question directly, the technology that we're using today without thinking we would be terrified 50 years ago, 20 years ago. So the technology that will be implemented to counter illicit trade is absolutely possible, feasible, and it will be part solution. Some of it of the burden will be carried by the companies, some of the burden will be carried by the governments, some of the burden will be carried by individuals. It has to be that way. The story that I always like to tell is that you know that in London, in House department store, they installed the first escalator in the world in that store, and it took people really some time to adjust to self-moving stairs. They actually had to hire 2 additional people to put it on top of the stairs to welcome gentlemen with a shot of sherry and ladies with the sniffing salts, because they were so terrified and using that technology. Today, do we think even twice before we step in the escalator? No, not anymore. So there are different technologies that are offered across the world by very innovative companies, including what Carlos has mentioned, including VOC, including many others, through provision of digital identity. Because digital identity, one quick point I want to make, as we move in the IoT space, it's not only about the people anymore. How do you know that the device that is talking to you is actually a device it claims to be? So digital identity now has to be absolutely embedded in the Internet of Things as well as Internet of People. So perhaps I will stop here, Carlos.
And another point, maybe, Danil, is the role of the dark web into all this, right? Because we didn't take that into consideration. Any of the existing crawlers do not crawl the dark web. Actually, PMI Impact has provided one of the grantees is Stanford University working on a crawler that crawls into the dark web, which I think is an extraordinary project. But a lot of the illicit weapons are being traded in the, this is a major issue. And the dark web is a phenomenal architecture that allows anonymously to do anything you want to do illegally with very little chances to ever be. So while we have this dark web in competition with the web, the light web, it's going to be very difficult to fight a proper battle with equal arms, right? Okay, so we have more questions related. You have been answering some of the questions. Thank you very much, by the way. So we have one question about your, Alvise, I know the answer as well. We've been working that on your technology projects like ICOs. I'm sure you are, this is the front end for you in terms of how that compares to the traditional products in terms of making very difficult to counterfeit.
Well, the product is completely different. The reason why we launched the ICOs is clearly not to fight counterfeiting, because it's really to produce a product and to offer a product to a consumer who don't want to switch and want to continue using tobacco, but to use tobacco in a better way. And this is how ICOS was developed. Now, the fact that the device is full of technology, I do think is helping reducing counterfeiting of the device and the little the heats, which is the consumable you put in, simply because I think the expertise to produce cigarettes is out there. There's plenty of expertise. The machinery to produce cigarettes, there's plenty of it. Second-hand machinery. Machines to produce cigarettes can last 50, 60 years. Instead, for the new products, the technology is limited because it's in the hands of a few companies. And the machineries there are no big quantities of machinery on the second market. So all those things make the counterfeiting of our products more difficult, which is clearly a great side effect of this new development technology. I think that's true in many aspects for our products. You always have to keep one step ahead of counterfeiters innovating and introducing more sophisticated and added value products. So it's a good side effect, definitely, that we are finding that the ICOS is attracting less smuggling, less counterfeiting.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are reaching the hour and a half that we had with this roundtable. Just maybe as a conclusion, each of you, if you can give me just some ideas on how do you think, both privately in your own organization, but also collectively as a group, we can be more efficient on illicit trade. And if you have any announcement or activities that you are doing, events that you're organizing, or anything that will help further create awareness about the problem, please, you're most welcome. So we start with Teresa. And
Thank you very much. Well, let me just add something again from the angle of consumer protection. I do believe, and I'm sure that those who are working with companies know this very well. I think that through consumer surveys and increasingly through the use of behavioral insights in policymaking, namely consumer policymaking, it is really possible to influence the behavior of consumers. And again, we come back to the education and to the information. So definitely consumers can be drawn, can be directed to illicit trade. Sometimes if we are talking about younger groups of consumers, maybe through some sort of role models. Of course, consumers that have less income may be less able to make the best possible choices according to ethics and legitimate activities. But I do believe that nowadays we have so many instruments that can really help us, again, reach out to consumers. So this is something that I wanted to underline, because I do believe that in our very recent work in UNCTAD, we have engaged with business representatives, with academia, of course, with other international organizations, and these partnerships that other panelists mentioned are really the way through, I believe, for us also to fight more effectively illicit trade. And finally, another point regarding the work, the broader work of UNCTAD against illicit trade, because as I said in the beginning, we do believe we are quite well placed to continue these efforts. We will be reaching out to over 20 international organizations and to organize a number of events that, of course, this year since March were put on hold due to the confinement. But I do believe that there is great interest in this topic, and we have heard just on this panel so many different stakeholders and perspectives. So I wanted to reassure you that UNCTAD stands ready to further explore this topic, and we'll be very happy to welcome you and to engage with you and your organizations in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you. We look forward as well. Alvise, just going to say in order of the initial.
Look, for interest of time, there is no easy solution. Like, it's a very complex problem, so you need a comprehensive solution. I repeat what I said at the beginning, and what also Teresa mentioned. I think public-private partnership is a key to solve the issue, simply because the problem is just too big for any state, for any organization, for any international organization. You need cooperation. So for me, that is the most important thing. And simple things like this webinar, I think, helping sharing information, knowledge, creating a network, and connecting people. Because if I would add a second point is people make the difference. And so connecting people is also extremely important.
Totally. At the end of the day, it's personal engagement for sure. So Jeffrey?
Well, you know, as I think it was Teresa who said in her opening remarks, you know, illicit trade is already a significant percentage of so many markets, whether that's illegal fishing, whether that's counterfeiting, whether that's 1 in every 10 cigarettes sold, 1 in every 4 bottles of alcohol. It's already a major problem. Post-crisis, Yeah, I think really a lot of we're eager to get our sleeves rolled back up and get back to work, and whether that's working with UN agencies like UNCTAD, or whether that's working in national capitals addressing specific issues, and like we were talking about before, you know, the challenges of formalizing markets. It's big problem, and there's a lot that governments can achieve by cleaning up the illicit trade in their countries. I think that, you know, the list goes on of all the things that need to be done by strengthening customs or rationalizing tax policies. It's an endless list, right? I think though that two main takeaways perhaps from the crisis experience. There's one thing that's been mentioned here several times is the supply chain and how that's going to be restructured. And one of the things that has always allowed illicit trade to flourish is the vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And sometimes those vulnerabilities are common to, you know, multiple types of illicit trade. So I think coming out of the crisis, we would want to double down on that area, common vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And also online shopping. So I mentioned earlier, this is already a place where there's significant fraud. We're already aware of that. And to the extent that it keeps growing, it's going to create more opportunities for illicit trade. So I think the time is right really to double down on that. I think that Teresa spent some time talking about this consumer guidelines. It might be the best kept secret in Geneva. This is an extremely powerful tool where the UN has the ability to reach every government in the world directly into the consumer protection agencies here. Because, you know, a lot, when we talk about the customer side, all forms of illicit trade have one thing in common, and that's fraud. So to the extent that we can help people understand that this is an issue of fraud to the consumers, all of a sudden you have a massive tidal wave of consumer protection agencies, people, voices. You see what happens anytime there's any kind of a product, any kind of a scare. When the consumer protection voice gets involved, things change. It moves the needle. And so I think that tool, combined with looking at the increasing potential online, are in addition to the supply chain things we need to focus on.
I agree. I think reaching the consumer is the key, and is actually, customers are always right? So that mentality is already well established in the brands. They know the importance of their consumers. So fully agree. Giovanni, some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I would say that what we have to do is take advantage of the terrible disaster that is this current crisis. I think there is a reset happening, and that reset is not bound to last forever. Eventually people will get accustomed to the new normal, whatever that new normal will be. But what we see in the illicit wildlife trade certainly is that there's tremendous interest in this issue and tremendous awareness of the risks that are associated with it, both among consumers, but also among firms that wittingly or unwittingly facilitate it. So I think for all of us, and I'd imagine this applies to other illicit types of trade as well, while we are in this unusual situation where normal patterns don't really quite apply, normal behavioral patterns, that's an opportunity for us to try and adjust these behavioral patterns, seize that opening, and try to prevent sort of going back to the old ways once things normalize.
Thank you very much. Daniel?
Sure, we're already 10 minutes behind the schedule, so I'll be extremely brief. I just second everything that has been said. We stand ready to work with all the groups. I think the panelists really confirmed their determination to drive the change. Let's not waste a great and terrible crisis, and let's be thoughtful as we redesign our supply chain, as we deploy the tech to find the solutions, as we educate the consumers, as we work in the governments and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anil. Christopher?
Yes, thank you, Carlos. Well, we look forward to continue organize. We're very proud to collaborate with OIST and WISEKey, PMI Impact in the future on this theme to raise the awareness. And this will be part of our program next year in June 2021, when the next Zermatt Summit will take place from the 17th to the 19th of June. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bruno?
Thank you, Carlos. I think this time is my turn. So I want to only emphasize and highlight what Alvise said, that this is, we are in the middle of a complex problem, and that can be only solved by complex solutions, which only could come from the combination of the experts and knowledge of different actors. And in that sense, we have our completely disposal to collaborate with any framework on which we can find and discover solutions to solve only part of this problem. Our institution have a lot of experience combining the synergies from different actors, since we were created by different kind of members, means national government, regional governments, municipal governments, chamber of commerce, private sector. You know, it was very complicated to put a single understanding between all that actors, because all of them were completely different, but it's the only way to find kind solutions could apply at global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like to now take the floor just to thank you all for what I know is your personal commitment. I know that this goes beyond your job. I know the fight against illicit trade is an emotional fight, first of all. We have to have that in our heart before it goes to our mind. So I thank you very much for that level of commitment. Just use as much as we can the infrastructure we have built. WISEKey is now a large company. We managed in 20 years to bring to the NASDAQ, and we are a success story. WISEKey has technology that can be used and is being used by millions of objects now. We announced the other day 1.5 billion objects already includes a microchip that we produce. So that means 1.5 billion objects, and they are not going to be able to be counterfeited because the technology protects them. And the projections of that is that we should be around the 25 billion in the next years to come. And OISTE is playing a major role because the software part that makes a unique person or object digitally, which is the cryptographic root key, is already installed in 6 billion devices. So this is big numbers. We are one of the largest install base in the world, beyond any of the multinationals. And OISTE is an NGO, is being related with the ECOSOC. We are working with Global Compact, and we are very much involved with the UN and specialized agencies. As the only role is to make this open and to anybody to use and to work. Actually, on this visitor, we have many UN officials that have joined us today. We have many permanent missions in Geneva as well that they are joining. We had 150 people, now we are 85. Some people left because we are beyond time. So we will continue doing those webinars with the cooperation of OISTE and Zermatt Summit and PMI Impact, which, by the way, I am one of the members as well of the PMI Impact expert group. And our intention, again, is to bring concrete solutions to this very serious problem that affects so many people. So I would like to thank you for your participation. All the information will be available in oiste.org website, including the copy of the video broadcast. If there's any questions, we will address to you. Next event, WISEKey is organizing with the Geneva government a event by the end of July on the new applications that they are being developed for COVID traceability. So we are bringing a group of experts, people representing IATA, the airline companies, because that is going to be important for people boarding into planes. So we have been developing some technology that allows people to certify that they are not infecting other peoples, and do that in a way that is not detrimental to their privacy. So that is going to be our next webinar. And that's all. I'd like to thank the team working, both OISTE and WISEKey, Zermatt Summit, and PMI promoting this event. and you guys for your amazing participation. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will conclude here. All the best.